Good morning. I was looking at my latest pension statement, which comes or changes once a year with the effects of indexation. Um, and it made me realise that I'd actually been retired and receiving a pension for 19 years, which makes me feel extremely old. But that aside, it made me realise that I am, like millions, I think, of others, fortunate enough to have a defined benefit scheme or final salary pension. And like most of these schemes, they are indexed. In my case, the indexation is to the RPI, the retail price index. Others are indexed to the consumer price index, which is probably not quite as advantageous as RPI, although there's not an enormous amount of difference. The principle, of course, is that they are indexed so that as inflation takes hold over the years, your pension income is adjusted to reflect that inflation, an extraordinarily valuable thing in retirement. But over my retirement years, and indeed in the years leading up to it, we've seen what I can only call a revolution in pensions. And this came home to me in particular when I was a trustee of the then, I think, £15 billion Shell pension fund. And I was trustee for 4 years. So, a subject that, in honesty, I hadn't paid a great deal of attention to before became very much top of the mind. It was work that I greatly enjoyed, by the way. It was very satisfying to be amongst immensely able pension people who, in the main, understood what they were doing and had a great deal of care for the pensioner community they looked after. And I'd include very much Shell in that, in setting up a defined benefit pension scheme originally. They were in line with other companies. It was the norm in those days, but nevertheless, they took it seriously, and I think still do take it seriously. It's also worth just stressing here, because people get confused a little bit about it, what pensions are. Pensions are, in effect, a deferred salary. So as you work, in my case, for nearly 40 years, as you work, you're paid a salary for what you do, of course, but you also build up pension rights. So, in a sense, you're deferring a small amount of your income over your employment years to enjoy a good pension in your retirement years. And of course, your company, Shell in my case, makes a contribution towards that as well. So it's a model which, for most of my working life, seemed the norm, frankly, that all employees would, in retirement, receive a pension based directly or more loosely on their final salary, less, of course, but still based on it, and linked to inflation to protect you in retirement. So those were the days in many ways. I don't want to go into too much detail why that changed. I've written about it, particularly in my biography of Alan Pickering, the pensions guru. But I would like to say just one or two things about what happened as a consequence of the decline of the defined benefit pension scheme. It went away in a rush, you know. It happened almost overnight, and it happened at the time of financial trauma just before the turn of the millennium. and it was a consequence of that, more than a conscious decision on the part of employers to move away from providing guaranteed pension benefits that really counted. So it was almost an accidental thing. There was no government policy to phase out defined benefit pension schemes. There was no debate in Parliament on the subject of DB pension schemes. It was in part a consequence of the liberalising of financial services in the period of the 1980s, and the presumption that pensions should fit into the area of financial choice, like investment and other financial matters. But it was never a conscious decision to phase out DB schemes. I should also mention, and it's worth stressing this point, although companies decided gradually to withdraw new employees from DB schemes, and Shell was quite late actually in doing this, but did it along with most others. Although companies made that decision, that didn't in any way affect the rights of existing members of the pension schemes, least of all pensioners. So with the switch from DB schemes to something else, my rights as a pensioner and those of my fellow pensioners were not in any way affected. So we were lucky in that respect. Let's talk for a minute about what replaced defined benefit, final salary pensions. Those pensions are, of course, excuse me, those pensions are of course, protected by the pensions law, the law of trust, which sets down fairly clear rules about how a pension scheme should be managed. So we're in a separate legal framework here from normal corporate governance, and that's worth stressing actually, that a defined benefit pension scheme, a trust for one, is not directly on a day-to-day basis affected by the ups and downs of the sponsor of the fund, that is the company who ultimately is guarantor of the fund. And my own company's fund, some 16 billion pounds worth of it, is a pretty robust financial instrument in its own right. It can meet its obligations, and one never knows in the strange world we live in now, but it's unlikely, I think, that the scheme will get into a situation where it can't meet those obligations. And that's generally the case. There are exceptions, and there are ways that difficulties can be ameliorated by those companies' pension schemes where there are some financial issues, but I don't particularly want to go into that now. They are exceptions, thankfully, that prove the rule. Okay, let's go back to that time in the early part of this century, the new millennium, when slippage occurred away, and rapid slippage occurred away from defined benefit pension schemes to something else. Now, the way that an employer, and Shell is included in this, the way the employer will describe what happened is that they will say that they had moved away from a defined benefit pension scheme to a defined contribution pension scheme, sometimes called a money purchase pension scheme. Now, I've always taken the view, and people much more distinguished in the world of pensions than me often take the same view, that there's a degree of confusion but in using the term defined contribution pension scheme. And the reason that there's confusion is that it suggests that it's in some way a replacement for the defined benefit pension scheme. And nominally it is, but it's a very different animal indeed. I started this little chat by saying that I'd just received my April pension payment, which reflected the rise in pension instituted at the end of last year. A defined contribution so-called pension scheme is nothing like that. What is it then? Well, in essence, a DC scheme or a money purchase scheme is a savings scheme. So money is put away by the employee into a fund, and the employer will add to that. So superficially, similar to a defined benefit pension scheme, but only superficially. The reason is that that pot that is built up in the defined contribution scheme is uncertain, in the sense that the level of, or the value of your pot is in no way guaranteed. So, for example, if a substantial portion of that investment saving is in equities and the stock market falls, your pot will fall in value at the same time. Again, contrast that with the DB scheme, where there may well, and there always is, investments in equities. And again, if equities fall, then the total value of the fund will fall as well. But that doesn't affect your rights as a pensioner. They are guaranteed irrespective of the status of the fund, the financial status of the fund. So we're not really comparing like with like. Let's return to money purchase, to the defined contribution scheme. We've got a pot being built up over time, and in an ideal world, that pot on retirement or around retirement can be employed to produce an income stream. So it's the old annuity thing, isn't it? You make an upfront payment, and in return for that, you get a flow of income as long as you stay alive. And you'll recall that a few years ago, George Osborne decided that it would be more in the pensioners' favour, or prospective pensioners' favour, to allow that pot to be used not just for the purpose of purchasing an annuity, which was the law until that point, but for anything at all. And so we got the pensions minister talking about, if you want to buy a Lamborghini with it, you can. He was being a little facetious, but he was making the point that as you retire, the pot is there for you, and you can do what you like with it. Now that, of course, is not the case of the defined benefit scheme at all. You can, and most of us did, withdraw a small percentage of the value of the fund, or your value, your part of the fund, in as a lump sum, but that's unlikely to be much more than 10%. The rest of your investment is part of the guarantee process, which gives you a pension, index-linked pension, for the rest of your life. So when we look at defined contribution schemes, it's very difficult to see them as anything other than savings schemes, albeit that the savings scheme is not just your savings, what you're diverting from your expenditure, but is in most cases added to by your employer. So it's better than putting your money in the post office savings bank. But it's as vulnerable, frankly, as any other investment. So if your thing is stocks and shares, you don't need to be told that stocks and shares go up and down. If your thing isn't playing the stock market, but you just want to carry on living a reasonable life in retirement, you're frankly in the hands of economic development, stock market development, stock and share changes in price, and so on. So that really is the new world, 20-year-old world of pensions, a major switch from certainty and guarantees, and has to be said to those for those of us who are lucky enough to enjoy it, the guarantee that your retirement will be properly funded, whatever happens. That is no longer the case. Again, one goes back to where I started in talking about indexation. My monthly pension this month was 66% higher than the first monthly pension I had 19 years ago, solely driven by RPI, or by price index recalculation each year. You will have no such guarantee if you're reliant on a lump sum investment. If you buy an annuity, you will get what that annuity predicates, and if you can afford it, there will be index-linked annuities available, but they'll be fairly expensive, and again, nothing to compare with the guarantee of DB schemes. It's not my job, and you shouldn't listen to me even if I try, to recommend to anybody what they should do. There is one recommendation, however, which I think I can reasonably confidently make, and it's somewhat controversial, and pensions world doesn't always really want to address this issue, but I will. If I was 25 with reasonable prospects, for whatever reason, a skill, an education, a talent, or whatever, and I was looking around for a decent, reasonably secure, enjoyable, satisfying job, I would look to the public sector than I would to the private sector. That may be because I'm a bit risk averse, but it's primarily because the pension scheme for the public sector is significantly advantageous compared with defined contribution, money purchase, private sector schemes. That is because public sector pensions bear far greater resemblance to defined benefit schemes like the one I benefit from than they do to anything in the financial services sector, like defined contribution schemes. They're not technically, in the main, there are exceptions, they're not technically defined benefit pension schemes. There are some, particularly amongst the local authorities. What they are is a guaranteed pension underwritten by government. So if you're a nurse, for example, your post-employment pension will not be paid out of built-up assets in a pension scheme, but paid for out of the exchequer. In other words, they are government expenditure on an annual basis, not underwritten by any lump sums hidden away anywhere. They're a defined benefit pension scheme without a proper scheme, a proper financially underwritten and managed scheme. Now, I'm not arguing for or against that. That's a matter of financial management at a high level, but it's a fact. So what am I saying? Am I saying that's a bad thing? No, I'm not. I'm not making a judgment about it. I'm just saying that if you, my 25-year-old example, get a job that you like in the public sector, and it provides you with an adequate income, which it probably will, it will also provide you with an adequate index-linked pension. It's not the RPI, it's the CPI, but that doesn't particularly matter, in my opinion. RPI is better, but you're in on the margins when you're talking about those two indices. So that, to me, is the absolutely key thing for youngsters in their 20s managing their career for their parents or others who advise them, unless you've some objection or can't find an appropriate public sector job, unless you want to throw yourself into the private sector, and having done that myself, I can quite see why many would want to. Just realise that when you reach retirement age, even if you manage your financial affairs very shrewdly and have the resources to do that, when you reach retirement age, your friend down the road who decided to work in education or healthcare or any other area of the public sector will be potentially benefiting from an index-linked pension linked to his final or her final salary, whereas your position may be somewhat less advantageous. Okay, that's really all I wanted to say on the subject. I wanted to try and say it because I do find that there's a fair amount of confusion about the whole subject of pensions, and I actually believe it's more simple, that it's simpler than sometimes we're led to believe. I wish you well, and I hope this has been of some value.